Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Donald Trump's former presidential campaign manager has been charged with conspiring to defraud the United States. It's one of 12 criminal charges brought against Paul Manafort and one of his business associates, including conspiring to launder money. It's alleged the two men received $75 million in all from pro-Russian politicians in Ukraine. It's also emerged that another advisor to President Trump has pleaded guilty to lying about his links to Russia. All the charges have been brought as part of an investigation into alleged Russian interference in the US election. Our North America editor John Sobel has been following the day's dramatic events as they unfolded.
Mr. Manafort, are you turning yourself in to federal authorities today?
This isn't how it was meant to be.
Mr. Manafort has no comment.
Just over a year ago, the multimillionaire Paul Manafort was Donald Trump's campaign chairman and a figure of huge influence. Today, he's been ordered to an FBI field office to face the most grave charges. Normally talkative, today, much more tight-lipped. The indictment runs to over 30 pages and details a complex web of financial arrangements to keep vast sums secret from the US authorities. It details how Manafort was working as an agent for the pro-Russia party in Ukraine, from whom he received tens of millions of dollars in payments for a decade until 2016. It's alleged he laundered $18 million through various accounts and companies. And by any means, almost $1 million was funneled through an antiques rug store in Alexandria, Virginia. $850,000 laundered through a men's clothes store in New York.
It adds a substantial layer of complexity. I think just the Ukraine and the Russian connection could add months and months to this investigation.
But in response to the indictment, Donald Trump has tweeted angrily, "Sorry, but this is years ago, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. But why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus?" And then another tweet on Russia. Also, there is no collusion. And that was the line being taken by Donald Trump's lawyer.
The allegations in the indictment, though, are focused on their business activities, not campaign activities, not campaign events.
But today, a separate, deeply damaging disclosure. This man, George Papadopoulos, a foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign, who President Trump once described as an excellent guy, secretly pleaded guilty earlier this month to lying to the FBI about his contacts with Russian officials during the campaign. And this former State Department official and international lawyer says that could be much more significant.
Well, Manafort is a bigger figure, but we expected the charges and the indictment to come out against him today. Papadopoulos' guilty plea discloses facts of communications between the Trump campaign and Russia that we didn't know about, and that could be a much bigger problem for Trump.
And the charge sheet against Papadopoulos says that he's cooperating fully with the authorities. In other words, it looks like he's prepared to reveal more information as part of a plea bargain. And that might give other White House officials sleepless nights and cause to engage their own lawyers, and quickly.
So, John, with these dramatic events today, how close is this investigation into alleged Russian interference in the US election getting to the president himself?
Before I come to that, let me just tell you that, as I understand it, Paul Manafort and associate Rick Gates have just pleaded not guilty in the courthouse behind me, where they've made their first appearance. But as to the question of how close is this getting to Donald Trump, look, the special counsel was set up to investigate whether there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians. As I speak to you now, there is still no evidence of that. However, Paul Manafort has been charged because of the money he took from Ukrainians backing Russia. We have had this other extraordinary disclosure today of a national security advisor, George Papadopoulos, who has pleaded guilty and is cooperating actively with the FBI over the Russia investigation after he said that he lied about it. So all of that suggests that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, has an awful lot more work to do. This is not going to be over quickly as the White House would like, and the White House is trying to deflect attention onto the Democrats and problems they might have had in terms of the Russians. But this investigation is not going to go away. This is not the end. Maybe it's the end of phase one. And within the White House, I would imagine now, a good deal of anxiety.
John Soper in Washington, thank you.
Once and for all.
Well, I want to take you now right across live to the White House, where press briefing is going on as we speak. Let's listen in.
I believe it was last week, and I've said several times before, there's no intention or plan to make any changes in regards to special counsel. But look, today's announcement has nothing to do with the president, has nothing to do with the president's campaign or campaign activity. The real collusion scandal, as we've said several times before, has everything to do with the Clinton campaign, Fusion GPS, and Russia. There's clear evidence of the Clinton campaign colluding with Russian intelligence to spread disinformation and smear the president to influence the election. We've been saying from day one there's been no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, and nothing in the indictment today changes that at all.
But the George Papadopoulos agreement is about the campaign. It is specifically about the campaign.
It has nothing to do with the activities of the campaign. It has to do with his failure to tell the truth. That doesn't have anything to do with the campaign or the campaign's activities.
But it is the clearest evidence yet of ties between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. So.
Again, there are no activities or official capacity in which the Trump campaign was engaged in any of these activities. Most of them took place well before the campaign ever even existed. John?
Sarah, can you just explain what George Papadopoulos' role with the campaign was?
It was extremely limited. It was a volunteer position. And again, no activity was ever done in an official capacity on behalf of the campaign in that regard.
What about the outreach that he was making to campaign officials to try to put together this meeting?
You mean the outreach that was repeatedly denied and pushed away and said we're not going to take any action on that?
Can you explain what happened with his outreach?
He reached out and nothing happened beyond that, which I think shows, one, his level of importance in the campaign, and two, shows what little role he had within coordinating anything officially for the campaign. John Decker.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I wanted to ask about Mr. Mueller's investigation. The president at times has called it a hoax, and he's called it a witch hunt. You've used similar type of language before as it relates to his investigation. Last week you indicated, Sarah, that you believe that Mr. Mueller is wrapping up his investigation. And I've heard similar things coming from other senior administration officials. Do you still believe that Mr. Mueller is in the process of wrapping up his investigation?
We still expect this to conclude soon. Yes. Francesca?
Thank you, Sarah. Paul Manafort was high-ranking in the president's campaign at one time. I'd like to know what the president's relationship is with him now. Do they still talk? When was the last time they might have had contact?
As far as we can tell, we know that they haven't spoken in several months. The last known conversation was back all the way to February. And as far as anything beyond that, with Paul, I'm not sure of any other contact. I know that there was some initial contact after the president was sworn in with him at meetings here at the White House, but nothing directly with the president. Deborah?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. On March 31, according to the affidavit by Mr. Papadopoulos, he attended a foreign policy meeting. The president was there. He said that he talked about how that Russia wanted to talk to the president. What did the president think when he said he wanted to arrange a meeting between Trump and Putin? And how did other people in the campaign react to that?
I'm not sure that the president recalls specific details of the meeting. Again, it was a brief meeting that took place quite some time ago. It was the one time that group ever met. And beyond that, I really don't have anything to add. John Gizzi?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. As you mentioned, Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates were named in this for things not having anything to do with the campaign, but with alleged money laundering regarding other business. Now, under those circumstances, would the president consider or rule out pardoning either of them?
I haven't had any conversations with him about that. I think we should let the process play through before we start looking at those steps. And
Papadopoulos at this time was referring to Jeff Sessions at the time, who was overseeing Trump's Foreign Policy Advisory Committee. What does this mean for Jeff Sessions?
somebody on a volunteer committee. I'm not sure how that would impact the Attorney General directly.
Can you say, given what we have learned over the last few hours, can you say when the president was first aware that Russia was behind the hacking and was in the possession of emails, what they considered to be damaging emails about the Clinton campaign that they were trying to get to the Trump campaign? When was he first aware of that?
I'm not sure of the specific date of when that took place, so I'd have to look into back to Jeff.
Sarah, does the president regret having hired Paul Manafort to be his campaign manager? And is he and the rest of the White House concerned that this issue will distract from tax reform and the other domestic policy and foreign policy?
We're not worried about it distracting because it doesn't have anything to do with us, because this is something that is action that took place outside of the campaign or campaign activity.
And as far as whether he regrets having hired him to be a campaign manager?
I didn't ask him that question specifically.
Sarah, how can you describe Mr. Papadopoulos as having a limited role when there's a photograph of Mr. Papadopoulos sitting at a table with
The
then
president
candidate
has
Trump
thousands
at a
of
national
photographs with
security meeting.
millions of people, so.
He was also cited by then candidate Trump in a meeting with the Washington Post as to who his top foreign policy advisors are. That seems to fight against what you're saying. And also, how is it not collusion when George Papadopoulos is in contact with various people who are promising dirt on Hillary Clinton? A series of events that closely mirrors what occurred with the president's own son.
This individual was on a...
In pursuit of information that was damaging about the Clintons. How is all of that not collusion?
Look, this individual was the member of a volunteer advisory council that met one time over the course of a year, and he was part of a list that was read out in the Washington Post. I'd hardly call that some sort of regular advisor, or as you want to, push that he's like a senior member of the staff. He was not paid by the campaign. He was a volunteer on a council that met once.
Collusion activities, Sarah. He was pursuing information from the Russians.
Again, he was a volunteer. I think that's something you need to ask him. I'm not here to speak on behalf of the thousands of people that may have volunteered on the campaign.
Believe it or not, I have a question on this, but also on tax reform. The president has called on Congress to investigate Hillary Clinton. Is he confident that they will do that?
I think that's a question you have to ask Congress, but I think that there are enough reports and enough information out there that seems to suggest it might not be a bad idea.
Any congressional leaders of committees?
I don't know if he's had a member of Congress specifically tell him that they're planning.
My question about tax reform is where does the president stand on the idea of phasing in the corporate tax cut so it would reach 20%? Sometime around 2022.
I think the president's been clear that his priority is to make sure that that's where we start with the tax plan currently. I think, again, he's laid out what his principles are. As of right now, that hasn't changed, and don't anticipate that it will. Major?
Sarah, just so we have the terminology straight, when you say George Papadopoulos had no official capacity, what do you mean by that?
I mean, he was a volunteer on the campaign and a volunteer member of an advisory council that met one time.
So his activities were entirely of his invention. No one asked him to do any of these things. Is that what you're telling the American public?
I'm telling you that he was a volunteer member of an advisory council that literally met one time.
The reason I ask is now there are two episodes in which people associated with the campaign at a rather high level, at least in one instance, and George Papadopoulos is a member of a foreign policy or military advisory committee, sought dirt on Hillary Clinton from people representing themselves as either linked to or associated with the Russian government. Is that just a coincidence?
The only interaction I'm aware of that deals with this individual was him reaching out and being repeatedly denied. So that's all I can tell you is he asked to do things, he was basically pushed back or not responded to in any way. So any actions that he took would have been on his own, and you'd have to ask him about those because I can't answer.
Later activities of the campaign to have that same kind of meeting at Trump Tower.
I'm sorry?
What explains the campaign's later involvement with those associated with the Russian government, or said they were, to get dirt on Hillary Clinton later in the campaign?
And we've addressed that. They took one meeting, nothing came of it. No, I don't believe so.
That does not indicate a pattern of trying to obtain that information from that government.
getting information about your opponent. No, the big difference here is you have a meeting that took place versus millions of dollars being sent to create fake information to actually influence the election. You compare those two, those are apples and oranges. What the Clinton campaign did, what the DNC did, was actually exchange money. They took a meeting. Those are far different, and one is pretty common practice in any campaign to take a meeting. The other one is actually paying money for false information. That's a big deal and a big difference.
Thanks, Sarah. I have two questions for you, but first, if I could follow up on your comment there about the GPS dossier. This is an issue that many senior level administration officials have pointed to during these questions about the special counsel. Has the White House asked the Department of Justice to look into this issue?
Not that I'm aware of.
Can I follow up on Mueller? You've spoken with the president today?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us a little bit about his reaction to the news this morning? Obviously news that swept the nation's capital. But how did the president respond to this news about two people who did work for his campaign? Was he disappointed that Paul Manafort received this news today that he was being charged on these 12 counts?
He responded the same way the rest of us in the White House have, and that's without a lot of reaction because it doesn't have anything to do with us.
Sarah, we are now talking about two of the most senior members of the campaign at a very pivotal time, through and including the RNC last year, who are now under federal indictment
For something they did
serious crimes
outside
that
of the campaign.
They did not allegedly conduct during their work for the campaign. But doesn't it speak to the president's judgment that he would choose to have these two individuals in very high positions, having allegedly committed these crimes in the years leading up to their roles?
These were seasoned operatives, not, you make it sound like they were, regular offenders that have been in massive amounts of trouble. These were seasoned operatives that worked on a number of campaigns. Paul Manafort was brought in to lead the delegate process, which he did, and was dismissed not too long after that.
And the president has no regrets.
Again, I didn't ask him that question specifically. April.
What leads you to believe that the Mueller investigation will conclude soon? Do you also believe that there could be more indictments? And my third question, on another subject, welfare reform. The president talked about this a couple of weeks ago, and I've been trying to find out what is the focus, how do you plan to implement welfare reform?
We haven't made any specific announcements when it comes to welfare reform. Those are ongoing conversations, and we're looking at ways to improve the system, but nothing specific to roll out at this time. Sorry, what was the first part of your question?
The first one, what leads you to believe that this will conclude soon, the Mueller investigation? Have you been given a heads up? What?
Those are the indications that we have at this time. I can't go any further than that.
Indications from who and where? Sarah, indications from where?
As I just said, I can't go any further.
And also, what about, you don't believe there'll be any more indictments at all?
That's a question you'd have to ask Robert Mueller.
You're saying that it's going to be concluded soon.
I still attend that we believe that it will be concluded soon, but beyond that, I don't have anything else to add on a specific time frame.
Sarah, in March, the president called March 2016, the president called George Papadopoulos an excellent guy. Does he still believe that Papadopoulos is an excellent guy?
Look, he was referring to the council. He was going through the list of names with the Washington Post, and nothing more than that, and complimentary of the people that were volunteering on behalf of the campaign.
One government told the FBI that a campaign supervisor told him, "I would encourage you to make the trip to Russia if feasible." How does that not constitute the campaign encouraging him to make contact with Russia?
I'm not aware of that conversation, so I can't speak to that.
Sir, at the end of the day, is there any concern at all from this administration, again, trying to drill down on what was asked earlier, that two people who worked for the president are now under indictment? One has pleaded guilty, and he promised to hire only the best people. Is this an example of the best people to hire?
Look, again, this goes back to these were activities that took place outside of the scope of the campaign. I can't comment on anything they did.
But are these the best people to hire?
Look, the president hired Paul Manafort to handle the delegate process, which he did, and he was dismissed not too long after that.
Sarah, last week the administration opposed a federal judge's decision that allowed an undocumented teen immigrant to have an abortion. Now that that case is over, it's been decided she's had that abortion. What is the White House reaction to that decision, and does it set a dangerous precedent going forward?
I can't comment on the specifics of that at this point.
At all? Did he comment on it?
I didn't speak directly with him about the case. Ronnie?
Sarah, thank you. I'd like to ask you about a different topic. Just breaking before the briefing, court
ban the president from changing military policy on service by transgender people. What's the reaction from the White House and the plan moving forward in reference to this?
Obviously, this is something just announced. The Department of Justice has it. They're reviewing it, and I'd refer you them to any specific questions.
Congressman Gowdy this weekend had suggested that there should be an investigation into the leaks of the grand jury investigation or Robert Mueller's investigation. Do you think there should be an investigation? Are you all asking for an investigation?
We haven't asked for that investigation to take place.
An investigation?
I think that anytime there is leaking of sensitive information, it should be looked into, but beyond that, we don't have any comment. Kristen?
Sarah, thanks. Does the president in any way hold Jared Kushner responsible for hiring Paul Manafort? After all, he was an early supporter of bringing him on board.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
And Sarah, to just follow up on the point of hiring the best people, the top people, he said, does this not at the very least raise questions about President Trump's vetting process and judgment when it comes to bringing on these people?
I don't believe so. I think I've answered that quite a few times today.
Sarah, two quick questions. Does the president, you said back in July that the president believed that the investigation for the special counsel should stay within the confines of Russian election meddling. Given what we've learned today, does the president believe Bob Mueller overstepped the boundaries of his investigation?
I haven't spoken with him specifically about that detail.
Okay, my second question, Sarah, would just be on the topic of regarding the plea agreement with George Papadopoulos. You've indicated that the president did not remember that March 31st meeting, the photograph, right?
No, I didn't say he didn't remember the meeting. I said he didn't remember those comments from
Did he remember anything about that meeting, his interactions with Papadopoulos, given that he's talked about his great memory?
I don't believe that he went into detail about the meeting itself. He remembers it taking place, but we didn't go into anything beyond that or any specifics.
And specifically did not remember the Russia comment? Did he remember Papadopoulos' presence? Did they have interaction?
Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Sarah. Gallup just came out with a poll giving 33% approval, 62% disapproval to the president. What's your reaction? Is the president aware of this? Any plans of changing anything?
Look, we're focused aggressively on pushing forward on a very bold agenda specific to tax reform, tax cuts. I think that the economy continuing to grow and strengthen is something that will certainly change those numbers. But at the same time, I think these are some of the same polls that also said this president would never be president. So
well, you're listening to Sarah Huckabee Sanders giving a series of fairly swift rebuttals in relation to Paul Manafort, Rick Gates and George Papadopoulos, all of whom were involved in Donald Trump's campaign in 2016 and have been in court this afternoon relating to the Russia inquiry.
Now, in the first public action by Special Counsel Robert Mueller, charges have been laid against 3 former Donald Trump aides, including his ex-campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, and his business partner, Richard Gates, have been indicted by a federal grand jury accused of conspiracy against the United States and conspiracy to launder money. Both have pleaded not guilty. President Trump says any alleged misdeeds by Manafort were years ago, insisting no collusion with Russia. Indeed, now that unsealed indictment makes no mention of Russia, but does allege financial relationships between Manafort and high-profile Ukrainians. And separately, London-based former foreign policy aide George Papadopoulos has admitted he lied to FBI agents about the nature of his interactions with people he knew were connected to the Kremlin during the campaign. The president has called Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election a hoax and a witch hunt. But for the White House, the probe has never been more perilous. It doesn't get more real than this. Donald Trump's former campaign chairman surrenders to the FBI at their field office in downtown Washington, D.C. on a cold autumn morning.
Any reaction to the charges, Mr. Manafort?
He's the first to feel the chill of Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller's wide-ranging investigation into possible collusion between Donald Trump's election campaign and Russia. In the end, it was alleged money laundering on a massive scale that led not only to his indictment, but also to charges against his former business partner, Richard Gates, seen here on the far left. Both have now entered not guilty pleas to charges that include conspiring against the U.S. The Department of Justice alleges Manafort and Gates funneled millions of dollars in payments into foreign companies and bank accounts opened by them and their accomplices in nominee names and in various foreign countries. That money allegedly flowed from and around this man, Viktor Yanukovych, the pro-Russian Ukrainian former president, and his party, for whom Manafort and Gates acted as political consultants, which they're alleged to have concealed from the US government. The alleged amounts are astonishing. In total, more than $75 million flowed through the offshore accounts. Manafort laundered more than $18 million, which was used by him to buy property, goods and services, income that he concealed from the US Treasury, the Department of Justice and others. The 31-page indictment signed with a flourish on the final page by Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller.
Paul Manafort has done an amazing job. He's here someplace. Where's Paul?
The president, who once called Paul Manafort close, today took to Twitter to take some distance.
Paul Manafort has done a fantastic job.
Sorry, he wrote, but this is years ago, before Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. Why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus? Also, he added for good measure, there is no collusion. The problem for the president is that the special counsel alleges Manafort and Gates were hiding payments from Ukraine's pro-Russian faction through at least 2016, when Paul Manafort was still his campaign chief, doing his bidding, bigging him up on the floor of the Republican National Convention.
We want Americans to understand who Donald Trump the man is, not just Donald Trump the candidate. You know, the composite of his career, not just from a business standpoint or a political standpoint, from a human standpoint as well. Yeah.
Now, though, it's the human side of Paul Manafort we're getting to know in the dock of the federal courthouse. A head-spinning fall from grace by a political operative who once groomed presidents for power.
As all of Washington waits to find out who and for what.
No one is immune to Robert Mueller's scrutiny. The latest Washington parlor game, who might come next? Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, Mike Flynn, his former national security advisor, or Carter Page, errant advisor. But here's a name you might not know. George Papadopoulos, junior foreign policy advisor, seen here seated 4 along from candidate Trump. It's turned out he's already had his day in court. A plea deal unsealed today reveals after he was arrested in July, he secretly entered a guilty plea 3 weeks ago to lying to the FBI about the campaign's outreach to Russia and his part in cultivating Kremlin contacts to obtain damaging information about Hillary Clinton.
He reached out and nothing happened beyond that, which I think shows, one, his level of importance in the campaign, and two, shows what little role he had within coordinating anything officially for the campaign.
It's nearly Halloween, just the time for what the White House calls a witch hunt. But the Mueller investigation seems to be weaving a web of facts that will lead some straight to the courthouse. I should just add that at that arraignment of Paul Manafort and Rick Gates a few hours ago, prosecutors asked that bond be set at $10 million for Manafort and $5 million for Gates, but said both could be detained at home, so effectively they're under house arrest until they can post bail. I'm joined now by Amanda Marcotte, who's in New York City and writes for the online magazine Slate. Amanda Marcotte, there was an expectation, perhaps, certainly in this town, that Paul Manafort might be one of the first people that we would see in court here. How serious is it for the Trump administration?
Well, the Manafort indictment is serious because it shows that, if nothing else, it shows that Donald Trump was willing to hire somebody who was kind of clearly dirty well before, that he didn't have the common sense not to hire somebody who was offering to work for free, in part because he was so wealthy because of his connections to Ukrainian pro-Russia forces. But I really do think that the guilty plea from George Papadopoulos is more serious right now, because he offers information about what the Trump campaign knew. He suggests he had multiple in-person meetings with the candidate himself, and now it's just a matter of what did they discuss during those meetings.
Amanda, it is though problematic, isn't it? Certainly for Democrats, many of whom there's a lot of wishful thinking tied up in this probe by Robert Mueller, that it will lead directly to the White House. I mean, the fact that he's opened, if you like, with this indictment against Paul Manafort, and the strongest you might be able to say about it is that you know, it shows that he didn't have a very good taste or very good judgment when it came to hiring staff. I mean, that's a long way from collusion.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that Democrats should not get their hopes too high right now. Mueller is probably trying to squeeze Manafort to find out more information. I don't know that this is over here, but what we've got right now is not enough. And frankly, the problem here isn't Mueller's investigation even, or what he's found. Mueller could find even more information. It doesn't really matter as long as the Republicans that are in Congress refuse to move and refuse to do anything about it. They're in leadership right now. They are the ones who have the choice to impeach Donald Trump. And I would argue that there's already enough on the public record to legally impeach Donald Trump if they were willing to do so. He's admitted to firing James Comey to obstruct the investigation. That alone is a crime.
But presumably, if there was enough evidence to impeach, that would already be underway. I mean, if we look at the politics of this, I mean, part of the reason why, when you talk to Republicans, even senators on the Hill, the reason why they're not coming out strongly publicly against the president is that many of them are up for re-election next year. They know that the Republican base still is very strongly in support of Trump. I think we're running at something like 80% in the latest polls, 80% of Republicans who support the president. So given those dynamics, it would be suicidal for many Republicans now to turn against the president, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and I think that's what people really need to understand is Donald Trump is being protected by politics, not by innocence. We don't know what he's guilty of, the extent of it, but we already know that he's said things in public that would have brought down a less popular president. And the Republicans right now are all afraid of being primaried in their own districts. They're afraid of crossing the president. They're afraid of how popular he is. They're afraid of Fox News turning against them. That's all that's going on here. It doesn't really have anything to do with, you know, I think even if Trump does have, even if evidence, foolproof evidence comes out that Trump colluded with Russia, they may not impeach him.
Amanda, just to finish, what happens if he sacks the special prosecutor? I mean, he's spoken before about possibly looking again at Robert Mueller. Certainly there's been that kind of background noise here in DC. If he did that, what would the impact of it be?
That's a really good question. It's tough to say. Again, I feel like the Democrats are already kind of marshaling what little political forces that they have on the Hill to speak out against firing Mueller, to organize as much as they can against it. But if they don't have any power in Congress, there's nothing they can do. I am unfortunately not confident that Paul Ryan or Mitch McConnell will lift a single finger to hold Trump accountable if he does something as sleazy and guilty seeming as firing Robert Mueller.
Okay, Amanda Marcotte in New York, thanks so much for joining us.
They say you can judge a man by the company he keeps. Well, if so, what to make today of the fact that President Trump's former campaign chairman has been charged with a string of offences by the special counsel investigating links between the Trump election campaign and Russia. The man in question, Paul Manafort, and a business partner turned themselves in today. A third man, another advisor, has already pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his links to Russia. The 12 charges against Manafort and Rick Gates involve both men's dealings with Ukraine. So, at the top of the list, conspiracy against the United States and to launder money. 7 counts of failing to report foreign bank and financial accounts, acting as an unregistered foreign agent for a pro-Russian group, and 2 counts of making false statements.
Careful, guys. Careful. Not since the heights of the Monica Lewinsky scandal has Washington seen such a legal and political drama playing out in front of this federal courthouse.
Mr. Manafort, why are you so convinced that you're not guilty?
Paul Manafort was the campaign chairman for President Trump. He is now charged with multiple financial crimes. His lawyer expressed outrage over the arrest and the cloud it puts over the White House.
Well, I think you all saw today that President Donald Trump was correct. There is no evidence that Mr. Manafort or the Trump campaign colluded with the Russian government. The claim that maintaining offshore accounts to bring all your funds into the United States as a scheme to conceal from the United States government is ridiculous. Thank you.
Are they on the same page?
Did the White House worry about what he might...
But the questions about whether the president may be in some kind of jeopardy himself will keep coming, with the press corps struggling to keep up.
The White House has no concerns about Mr. Manafort and the Trump campaign.
White House has no concerns, you say?
None.
Manafort was the strategist who guided candidate Donald Trump through the politically tumultuous summer months of 2016.
I've always found Paul Manafort to be a very decent man. And he's like a lot of other people, probably makes consultant fees from all over the place.
Manafort left the campaign because of his murky business connections. Also arrested and charged today was Rick Gates, another man who worked on the Trump campaign and the White House transition. To all of this, Trump is trying to keep his distance, saying the charges predate his presidential bid. "Sorry, this is years ago," Trump tweeted, before Paul Manafort was part of the Trump campaign. But why aren't crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus? And in a second tweet he added, using capital letters, also, there is no collusion. That counterattack was backed up a short time ago by the White House press secretary.
There's clear evidence of the Clinton campaign colluding with Russian intelligence to spread disinformation and smear the president to influence the election. We've been saying from day one there's been no evidence of Trump-Russia collusion, and nothing in the indictment today changes that at all.
But that key denial may be undermined by a new and dangerous development for the president. Another player in Trump's orbit, George Papadopoulos, seen here highlighted, has admitted lying to the FBI about his links to Moscow. And as a cooperating witness, he may have the knowledge to bring others down. It's possible Mueller will next focus on General Mike Flynn, a former national security advisor who has long had links with senior Russians. He even appeared at a dinner sitting next to President Putin, and he was sacked for lying about conversations with the Russian ambassador. Then there is Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, and Jared Kushner, the son-in-law. They had various under-the-radar meetings with Russian intermediaries during the campaign and transition. The independent counsel Robert Mueller has made his first move, creating shockwaves across Washington. But few here believe that Manafort will be the last to take this lonely walk into FBI custody. Tonight, on the eve of Halloween, Trump has emerged to greet children who are trick-or-treating on the South Lawn. But the nightmare for the White House will not end tomorrow night. But only when Mueller closes his investigation, and that could be many months away.
And Robert joins us now. Robert, is there any way at all of trying to work out how far this is going to go?
Well, look, this investigative process is unbelievably opaque and incredibly secretive. So there's much, Tom, that we don't know tonight. We don't know, for example, if those charged might be implicating others as part of a plea deal. We don't know, above all, whether that crack team of detectives and lawyers working under Robert Mueller are actually close to the investigative crown jewels. In other words, have they found actual evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia? And of course, the question looming over all of this is, if Trump finds himself in real political peril, might he actually try and sack Robert Mueller? That would create a constitutional crisis, but it means that we need to watch not just Mueller's actions, but also Trump's reactions. And of course, in this town, the big question is never, in this sort of process, who is charged first, but rather, who will be charged last.
OK, Robert, for now, thank you very much indeed.
Another day of drama in Washington with news of the first charges in the Trump-Russia investigation. Another day this US presidency's been distracted by substantial legal problems. Is the law, represented by the special prosecutor Robert Mueller, now starting to drift dangerously close to the president himself? There were two bits of bad news for Mr. Trump. One, possibly the less serious, is that his former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, and a colleague of his were charged with tax fraud and money laundering. Not good, and watch that space. But for now, the second bit of news is perhaps more dangerous, as it is directly relevant to the thing that really threatens Trump, his campaign's potential collusion with the Russians in trying to bend the course of the US election. A former Trump advisor, it emerged today, George Papadopoulos, has pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about contacts with a Russian professor who he knew was connected to the Russian government. Paul Manafort is the best known of the characters in the news today. He made himself rich by busying himself in Ukraine, helping the pro-Russian president Yanukovych. But he went on to help Trump, in fact, to lead his campaign. The charges today all relate to activity before he was working for candidate Trump. Money laundering and tax fraud they are, and all have been fiercely challenged by his lawyer.
He was seeking to further democracy and to help the Ukraine come closer to the United States and the EU. Those activities ended in 2014. over 2 years before Mr. Manafort served in the Trump campaign.
The difficulty for the president is that everyone expects there to be more. Special prosecutors often interpret their brief widely, and these indictments show Robert Mueller is no exception.
It's very unlikely that these are the charges that they will face. Prosecutors will often bring a superseding indictment. So they could face twice, 3 times as number of counts by the time they go to trial. This is just the start, not just for others, but for them.
Along with Mr. Manafort, a colleague called Richard Gates was also charged. But it is the third man that's raised most eyebrows today, 30-year-old George Papadopoulos. He's lower down the food chain than Manafort, but he was a foreign policy advisor and has admitted lying to the FBI about his Russian contacts. It turns out he was arrested in July and has now been cooperating with the prosecutor. The White House spokesperson tried to dismiss him as having little to do with the campaign.
It was extremely limited. It was a volunteer position. And again, no activity was ever done in an official capacity on behalf of the campaign in that regard.
The president's spokesperson shrugging off the Papadopoulos news today. His lawyer did the same. And of course, Mr. Trump himself, he tweeted, "Why aren't Crooked Hillary and the Dems the focus?" But as he likes to remind everybody, she didn't win and he did, which perhaps makes him a more interesting subject. Well, we've heard about the central characters in today's drama there, but let's talk to the BBC World Affairs correspondent, Paul Wood, who's been looking at this whole issue now for about a year, and in particular at Mr. Manafort's activities in Ukraine. And Paul, start with the news today. What for you sort of stuck out as most significant?
Well, there are 3 strands to the Russia story: money, politics and sex. The sex stuff concerns allegations the Russians have blackmail tapes of President Trump. Didn't hear about that today. What we did hear is allegations that Paul Manafort got paid a lot of money when he was working as a political consultant in Ukraine, which he then did not declare to the US tax authorities. This is the overarching allegation that Russian money in Ukrainian politics brought influence with Mr. Manafort, which in turn extended into influence with President Trump when he was campaigning for the office of the president. And this intersects with the political argument. We have a Mr. Papadopoulos, a junior part-time employee of the campaign, if you believe the White House press spokesman, who has admitted to having contacts with the Russians and lying to the FBI about it. So these 2 things, money and politics, are converging. Did money lead to political influence, and did that lead to collusion, cooperation with the Russians in the election?
Now, you have spent some time in Ukraine. You've been gathering there evidence of news as to what Mr. Manafort was up to there. Now, what have you learned there?
Well, the bad news for Mr. Manafort started in April 2016 when a page from a ledger belonging to the Party of the Regions was leaked, and next to Mr. Manafort's name was an amount of $12.5 million. He's always denied that that meant he got paid this money. But in Ukraine over the past week, we were able to meet with people who dealt with the secret internal Ukrainian investigation. Ukraine's domestic security service managed to infiltrate an agent into Mr. Manafort's operation. And they found, their agent found, and other sources tell them, that he was paid $600,000 a month over 4 years, $28.8 million to be precise. That is the funds detailed in one of these ledgers. They believe there are 2 further ledgers. So the sums really, in the words of one Ukrainian MP to me, are quite staggering. And the allegation is, you don't just get this for being a political consultant. This is for more, this is for influence.
Right. What do you make of the Trump defence today?
Well, the Trump defence is that it's all a witch hunt. In Mr. Manafort's case, I've spoken to him about this, not today, but earlier, and he says, you know, he was just trying to bring Ukraine closer to the West, closer to the EU. He was getting paid as a political consultant. The idea he was some kind of Russian agent is nonsense. Now, Mr. Trump has trotted out this witch hunt line quite a lot. He is quite right that there is no evidence yet of a treasonous conspiracy, no evidence of collusion. But remember that intersection between money and politics. The investigators are looking at whether Russian money bought Trump real estate, and they are looking at meetings that Mr. Trump's own son had with Russian officials. So the same problems that Mr. Manafort is facing, I think behind the scenes, that's where the investigators are looking to when it comes to the president himself.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's assess the damage to the president a little more closely. Joining me from Washington is Susan Glasser, founding editor of the political news magazine Politico, and from Los Angeles, Charlotte Laws, author and political commentator. Charlotte, let's start with you. How serious is this for the president?
I don't think it's serious at all. Manafort, these so-called or alleged financial crimes began a decade ago and really have absolutely nothing to do with President Trump. And the Papadopoulos situation is nothing as well, because he was a volunteer for the campaign. And I think basically what he was an aspiring fixer. There was a movie recently with Richard Gere called The Rise and Fall of the New York Fixer. And I think this kid, and I say he's a kid because he was 30 years old, probably a bit naive, and he probably wanted to be indispensable to Trump. He wanted to be a fixer where he put together Trump with Putin, so he would be the big shot. And I think he had a big ego about it. He was all over the internet talking about he had ties to Trump, that Trump liked him so much. So I think that's what this is really about, is someone who's a volunteer who's trying to make himself seem bigger than he really was. And it just kind of blew up on him because he didn't realize that there was something illegal with trying to do this activity.
Let me put the same then to Susan Glasser. Susan, do you think this is serious for the presidency? And which of these two stories, the Papadopoulos one or the other one, which is the more important?
Well, look, first of all, the answer is we don't know yet, but this is the first time since 1974 when the campaign manager for Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, was indicted and charged that we've had something like this in the United States. So it is most certainly a big deal when the guy who was the campaign chairman for the man who then became the president of the United States is indicted on charges that have to do with influence peddling and that have to do with lying to the U.S. federal government about it during and after the presidential campaign we had last year. So that's one thing. The Papadopoulos revelations, I think, are really the big news in many ways today in Washington, in the sense that it's a total surprise. This is a story nobody knew anything about. It suggests how tightly under wraps this investigation is, and it does bring the Russia collusion story directly inside the Trump campaign in these charges for the first time.
Susan Glasser, one of the theories about all of this is that this is just the start, and the Manafort story is going to turn out to be much bigger because they've got something on him. So now they can start trying to plead with him and to get him to cooperate with them to avoid serious jail sentences or whatever on the charges that are currently facing him. Now, if that happens, don't you go step by step towards the White House itself?
Well, again, we'll see how this unfolds.
Susan first and then Charlotte. Susan quickly and then Charlotte.
The history of prosecutions like this suggests that, in fact, it's a very common tactic to bring charges on financial matters or things like that, and then to build the bigger case slowly. Some of the testimony that's emerged today includes a lawyer for Mueller saying at the guilty plea hearing of George Papadopoulos that this was, in fact, one small part of a very large investigation. Many people here in Washington are wondering very much how close to President Trump it does go. But I think a lot of people feel like it stretches credibility to have the president himself and also his White House spokesperson making such claims from the government podium today about the president having nothing to do with any of this, and making it seem as though the president's own campaign chairman was barely involved with the campaign.
Right.
This is the kind of thing his lawyers would never advise him to do, the president, to get in the middle of commenting on this right now.
Charlotte, don't you worry that this is just a little step, and there's going to be more steps, and they will eventually lead to the White House?
You know, I really don't think so, because I don't think there's any there. And I think that it's very possible that Mueller, who has great authority to take this investigation any way he wants, might even start investigating the Democrats with Podesta, the Podesta Group, with Uranium One, with the dossier that was funded by the Democrats and Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's entirely possible that there could be indictments across both aisles. Or this could be the end of the investigation. Perhaps this is all that Mueller has. So I don't think we really know, and we're just going to have to wait and see.
Well, we will have to wait and see. But, Susan, is it the case that Trump supporters, at least for the time being, will say, look, this is just more people trying to obstruct the president from getting on with what the president wants to get on with, and just give the guy a break, get out of the way, and let him be president?
Look, clearly this is what they're saying. Your other guest seems to, have the talking points handout sheet. But I think you know, you have to judge each piece of this on its own. I think people make a mistake to sort of be pundits when it comes to an investigation that we know very little to nothing about. I think it's clear that these are serious charges that have been filed against Paul Manafort. The scale of the sums involved are eye-popping. You just had a report that was very interesting about your own correspondents reporting in Ukraine. But what he's charged with here in the United States is having $18 million in alleged money laundering flowing through accounts, and an additional $75 million flowing through what amounted to an effort to secretly lobby the U.S. government here in Washington on behalf of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, now deposed, and to cover it up. Those are very serious allegations in and of themselves. And one of the reasons why this Mueller investigation has started with Paul Manafort, it should be noted, is because this investigation was already occurring, and then it got wrapped up in the larger Mueller probe. So again, there is a natural logic to it. And I think, you know, again, we should take it for what it's worth right now. We don't know where Mueller's going
Susan Glasser,
with the probe.
Charlotte Lords, we need to leave it there. Thanks both very much indeed. Thanks.
So let's talk more with Andrew Pierce and Kevin Maguire. Some weighty issues to discuss, not least the Russia probe into the Trump presidential campaign. There's the front page of The Guardian. Trump now under new pressure, it says, after a former aide admits perjury in connection with those allegations.
And that is very serious, and it's getting closer to Trump. Of course, he always denies any knowledge, involvement, and so on. And
no collusion.
Yeah, you've not seen, you know, the killer blow yet. But I think one of his aides admitting perjury, another under house arrest for who was chair of his campaign for a while for money laundering and other offences, is pretty serious, because, of course, the perjury with George Papadopoulos involves Russians, and the money laundering is from alleged money laundering is Ukrainian money, but it's pro-Russian Ukrainian money. So it's getting very close, given that his son was being implicated, his son-in-law is being implicated to some extent. He has Facebook, Twitter now accept that they took money from Russian sources to run ads they shouldn't, because in America, well, the CIA has had a long record of interfering in other countries' elections. The Americans don't want it, I think quite rightly, their own. They shouldn't interfere in others. Nobody should interfere in theirs. But if you're Putin sitting in the Kremlin, you'd just be laughing your socks off at this. You've got an oaf in the White House who you want, and it's causing absolute chaos in the USA.
Because to be fair to Trump, Manafort, the charges relating to him were from 11 years ago. And
it was his business dealings, wasn't it?
So it had nothing to do with the campaign at all. The trouble for him is Papadopoulos, who lied over contacts with the Russians, lied about when he had those meetings. They had the meetings taken place when the election campaign had started, because the election campaigns in America go on forever. The thing is he now going to sing like a canary? And what has he got to tell us? That will be the worry if Trump has done anything wrong. He maintains, of course, on Twitter he hasn't, and he wants us all to focus on Hillary, because she's done a few dodgy things too in the campaign as well.
Well, it's said that Robert Mueller's technique is to put intense pressure on the key players and befriend the junior aides in the hope that they turn with the American equivalent of Queen's
Counsel. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And George Papadopoulos, has had a plea bargain and is cooperating now with the investigation, as you said. The details of which you hinted at. He had two meetings with people supposedly Russian go-betweens. One, an unnamed Russian woman who Mr. Papadopoulos believed had connections to Russian government officials, and he used her, or admitted seeking to use her connections in an effort to arrange a meeting between the campaign and Russian government officials. The other was an unnamed London-based professor who was said to have substantial connections to Russian government officials, and talks about Russian dirt on Mrs. Clinton, these thousands of emails allegedly mentioned by the professor at a breakfast meeting in London between him and Mr.
And a prof is named in the Telegraph, and the prof denies any wrongdoing. Of
course he does.
Very relaxed.
So was unnamed, now it looks like being named allegedly.
Is
that right?
There he is,
yes. There is. You'll have to blow it up.
Down the bottom, sorry.
Yep. We can't read it on the left.
I shall go down to it. So the British professor told Trump aide Russia had dirt on Clinton.
Yeah. Professor Joseph Mifsud, honorary director of the London Academy of Diplomacy, which is affiliated to the University of Stirling in Scotland. Scotland.
And
he
he's
says,
not-
I have a clear conscience.
But he's not named in the official court documents, which is interesting. But the Telegraph have done well there to get his name out.
If it's accurate.
If it's accurate. If it isn't accurate.
It was accurate.
Don't blame us.
Yeah,
blame
yeah.
the Telegraph.
Professor Joseph Mifsud, colon, an apology.
But questions now about the suitability of some of these people working with President Trump, or candidate Trump as he was.
Yeah, well, that's the
in
problem
terms of
he's
Manafort.
got. Because if the charges were upheld and they're convicted, Trump's been employing felons.
Yeah.
People will have been convicted of felony, and that will again call into question his judgment.
Well, the indictment suggests that at least £75 million in payments from Ukraine flowed through the accounts.
It's an astonishing
of his
amount.
Business.
A lot of money.
He spent $1 million on 8 rugs in 2 years, more than $1.3 million on
Doesn't
clothes.
everybody?
He had homes in. He had homes. Listen to this: Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Hamptons, Arlington, Virginia, and elsewhere.
As you do.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, very
Maybe
nice.
if you're a billionaire candidate, you mingle with those sorts of people. It seems normal.
You would
probably do.
No, it's getting that money offshore.
How much do you spend
allegations
on
clothes?
Yeah, how much do you spend?
Like 50 quid a year. I don't know, something like that.
It's gone up then. It's gone up. Gone up.
Anyway, we'll see what happens, what develops with that story. Certainly.
It's, as they say about this one, it's going to run and run.
Yeah,
Ooh, it's a gift that keeps on giving in terms of news.
Yeah, they say that too. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
sorry.
FBI closes net on Trump campaign aid. So other newspapers as well, also leading that.
Yeah, and it's interesting how some papers are going with this as the big story rather than the Westminster, Pestminster.
Which we